Welcome back everyone to my channel. Today, we're going to spend time talking about a topic that I believe is the foundation for a happy and successful life. That is how we can build and nurture truly healthy and positive friendships and work relationships. It might sound obvious, right? Who wouldn't want good friends and compatible colleagues? But in reality, it's not always easy. Why is building healthy relationships so important? Especially for young people who are starting their careers and middle-aged people who are at the peak of their careers and have many family responsibilities here in the US. Scientific studies on happiness and human health consistently show that one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction and longevity is the quality of social relationships. Having close friends and trustworthy colleagues can help us reduce stress, cope better with difficulties, feel supported, and belong to a community. For young people, building a network of friends and professional relationships early on is extremely important. Good friends can be a source of emotional support, share life and learning experiences together, and help each other in the first steps of their careers. Good relationships with colleagues in early jobs can open up new opportunities, provide guidance and learning. It's like building the foundation for a house. The foundation must be strong for the house to be stable, right? As for middle-aged people, healthy relationships become more precious than ever. At this stage, work pressure and family responsibilities can be very high. Having close friends can share the burden, find ways to relieve stress together, and simply have someone to laugh and cry with. In the workplace, good relationships with colleagues can create a positive work environment, promote cooperation, and help you feel respected and valued. It's like having more people in the same boat. Rowing together will be much easier, right? So, how can we actively build and maintain healthy friendships and work relationships? Here are a few ingredients and secrets that I've learned and want to share with everyone. The first and most important ingredient is authenticity and sincerity. No one wants to be friends or work with a fake person. Be your true self, with your strengths and even your weaknesses. Sincerity will attract people who are on the same wavelength and build the foundation for a lasting relationship. For example, a young person just started working at a company. Instead of trying to appear perfect or imitate others, they chose to show enthusiasm, a willingness to learn, and weren't afraid to admit when they made mistakes. That sincerity helped them quickly connect with kind colleagues and receive genuine help from them. It's like the old saying, true gold doesn't fear fire. Just be yourself and you'll find true relationships. The second secret is knowing how to listen. All of us want to be listened to and understood. When talking with friends or colleagues, really pay attention to what they are saying. Don't just wait for your turn to speak, but try to understand their feelings, thoughts, and perspectives. Ask questions that show interest and respond sincerely. For example, a friend of yours is going through a difficult time in their family. Instead of giving advice immediately, sit down, listen silently to their story, and just simply be there for them. Sometimes, all people need is someone to listen. In the workplace, when a colleague shares about difficulties at work, listen actively. Ask questions to better understand the problem, instead of interrupting or judging. You know, a good listener is always loved and trusted by everyone. You know, it's like older people often say, silence is golden. Sometimes listening is the most effective way to communicate. You know, the third secret is showing appreciation and support. You know, healthy relationships need to be nurtured with care and mutual help. You know, take time to congratulate friends when they achieve success. Encourage them when they face difficulties. You know, in the workplace, acknowledge your colleagues' contributions. Be ready to help them when they need it. And don't hesitate to express gratitude when you receive help from them. You know, for example, a colleague spent time guiding you on a new tool. You know, don't just say a quick, thank you. Express your appreciation more specifically. For example, thank you so much for taking the time to guide me. Thanks to you I understand this tool much better now. Sometimes a sincere thank you has great power. You know, or when friends are feeling down, proactively check in, invite them for coffee or do something so they feel cared for. You know, these small actions will build strong bonds. You know, the fourth secret is practicing empathy and understanding. You know, everyone has a different background, a different story. You know, try to put yourself in others' shoes to understand the reasons behind their actions or words. You know, this doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they do, but understanding will help you react calmly and more constructively. You know, for example, a friend suddenly behaves a bit annoyingly. You know, instead of getting angry and distancing yourself, try to think if something is happening in their life that is making them act this way. You know, maybe they are under work pressure, family problems, or simply having a bad day. You know, understanding can help you react more patiently and maintain the relationship. You know, in the workplace, when a colleague makes a mistake, try to understand the reason, instead of criticizing immediately. You know, maybe they lack experience, face technical difficulties, or are simply overloaded with work. You know, empathy can help you provide appropriate support. You know, the fifth secret is effective communication. You know, communication is the key to all relationships. You know, learn how to express your thoughts and feelings clearly, honestly, and respectfully. You know, when there's conflict, don't be afraid to face it constructively. You know, focus on finding solutions instead of criticizing or blaming. You know, use positive language and avoid words that can cause harm. You know, for example, you disagree with a colleague's opinion on an issue. You know, instead of saying, your opinion is wrong, try saying, I understand your perspective, but I have a different view on this matter. And then present your thoughts logically and with basis. You know, in friendships, if you feel uncomfortable about something your friend did, talk directly and sincerely instead of keeping it inside and feeling resentful. You know, honest, respectful communication will help resolve issues and strengthen the relationship. You know, the sixth secret is setting healthy boundaries. You know, in any relationship, having clear boundaries is very important to protect yourself and maintain mutual respect. You know your limits regarding time, energy, and what you are willing to share or accept. You know, learn how to say no politely when you can't or don't want to do something. You know, for example, you have a friend who often calls asking for help at inappropriate times. You know, instead of always saying yes and feeling bothered, you can say, I'd love to help you, but I'm busy with work, family right now. Can you ask me at another time? Or in the workplace. If a colleague asks you to do something outside your responsibilities and you are overloaded, you can explain the situation and politely decline. Setting boundaries helps you avoid being taken advantage of and maintain balance in your life. It's like older people often say, soft cords bind tight. Firmness with gentleness in setting boundaries can sometimes be more effective than being short-tempered. The seventh secret is being reliable and keeping promises. Trust is the strongest foundation of any relationship. Be someone that your friends and colleagues can rely on. If you promise to do something, try your best to accomplish it. If there's an unavoidable reason why you can't keep a promise, inform them and explain clearly. For example, you promised to help a colleague complete a part of a report. Make sure you do it on time and with the best possible quality. Or when a friend confides a secret in you, keep it confidential. Building trustworthiness requires time and consistency in actions. As the old saying goes, once bitten, twice shy. It's very hard to regain lost trust. The eighth secret is investing time and effort in relationships. Relationships are like a tree. They need to be watered and cared for regularly to grow well. Don't wait for others to always be the ones to initiate. Spend time with friends. Ask about their lives. Participate in common activities together. In the workplace, take time to build relationships with colleagues outside of work. For example, having lunch together, participating in company extracurricular activities. For example, despite a busy life, try to spend at least one weekend afternoon each month meeting up with your close friends. Or at the office, instead of just talking about work, ask your colleagues about their weekend. Share about good movies you've just watched. These small interactions will help build connection and camaraderie among colleagues. Finally, learn how to handle conflict constructively. Conflict is an unavoidable part of relationships. The important thing is not to avoid conflict, but to know how to face and resolve it maturely. Focus on understanding the root cause of the conflict, listening to the other person's perspective, and working together to find solutions. The goal is to strengthen the relationship after conflict, not to destroy it. For example, you and your best friend had an argument over a misunderstanding. Instead of getting angry and not talking anymore, choose a time when both of you are calm to sit down and talk honestly. Express your feelings sincerely, listen to your friend's explanation, and find ways together to avoid repeating that misunderstanding in the future. In the workplace, if you disagree with a colleague, discuss it directly and professionally, focusing on the work issue rather than personal attacks. Conflict that is resolved well can help relationships become stronger. The important thing is to realize that not every relationship can or needs to be maintained. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, a relationship is still toxic or unhealthy. In those cases, learning how to let go and move on is necessary for your mental health. As older people often say, the boat will straighten itself when it reaches the bridge. Sometimes for things to be peaceful, we need to accept and move on our own path. I know that building healthy relationships takes time, effort, and patience. It's a long journey. not a destination. You know, but what you gain from quality relationships will be incredibly rewarding. You know, it's support, joy, self-development, and a more meaningful life. You know, oh, and as I explained in previous videos, I've received many requests about the topic of foods good for memory and concentration, along with recipes and health advice. You know, I really appreciate these suggestions and your interest in personal health. You know, however, to ensure that today's video focuses entirely on the topic of building relationships, I'd like to keep the topic of food and health for a separate video in the near future. You know, I promise to prepare a very detailed and useful content on that topic to share with everyone. You know, thank you all very much for your patience and for continuing to suggest great topics. You know, going back to today's main topic, you know, I hope the sharing just now has provided everyone with knowledge and motivation to invest in building healthy friendships and work relationships. You know, remember, you don't need to have hundreds of relationships. Just a few quality ones are enough. You know, focus on nurturing truly meaningful connections. Okay, now it's time for me to hear from you. You know, what qualities do you think are most important in a healthy friendship or work relationship? Do you have any experiences or good stories about building relationships that you want to share? Or are you facing difficulties in building relationships and want to find advice? Please leave your comments below this video. You know, let's learn from each other and find the best ways to deal with difficult relationships. You know, or if you have any questions related to this topic, don't hesitate to ask. You know, thank you all very much for taking the time to watch this video. You know, I believe that by investing in healthy relationships, we will have a much richer, more meaningful, and happier life. You know, if you found this content useful and want to see more videos from me on topics related to life, self-development, and building positive relationships, don't forget to hit the like button. Share this video with your friends and family. And most importantly, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell icon right away so you don't miss any new content in the future. You know, your support is the biggest motivation to help the channel grow and bring more valuable content. You know, see you all in the next videos. You know, wish everyone always has wonderful relationships in life and at work. You know,